Greetings. So I think I finally figured out what this podcast is exactly, and much like my captions, it's really just whatever I feel like at the moment. And what I feel like at the moment is doing a book review of Stranger in a Strange Land and talking about how it relates to polyamory and how it helped me identify as polyamorous, while also talking about some other really interesting science fiction concepts. But first, I just wanted to give a quick update on the read aloud and Her Forever Virgin really quick, if for some reason you care about that. So I recently put out Chapter 6, even though in the read aloud, which I'm still editing that video together, I talked about how I hadn't put out Chapter 6 yet, which indicates to me the read alouds are not a great place to give updates. And surprisingly, I am almost done with Chapter 7. Actually, scratch that. I am done with Chapter 7. I just need to edit it, and then I can put it out there. So you'll be getting that sooner than expected. But anyways, getting into Stranger in a Strange Land. And just so that I could discuss it fully and my own thoughts on it and how it relates to sexuality, I'm going to give out this warning, which is to say that if you've never read Stranger in a Strange Land and you think that you might want to, which I highly recommend, just be warned that this video is going to contain tons of spoilers. So if you've never heard of the sci-fi classic Stranger in a Strange Land, it's the story of Valentine Michael Smith, a human who was raised by Martians after his parents died in a murder-suicide. Yeah, it never really occurred to me how important this particular part of the story might be. But as the story explains and why it's relevant to the plot, at least in the beginning, is that his mother had a husband that was on the spaceship, but she cheated on her husband with another crew member. And when Michael was born and it was clear that it wasn't his kid, he killed his wife, the father, and then himself. And then we never get an explanation as to why the other 5 crew members died, although it seems to be implied that the Martians might have disappeared them, as they so tend to do. But the reason why that is important to the plot, and why I never realized it was so important to the plot until I read it the second time, is that it's the first moment in which Heimlin talks about the dangers of jealousy. And obviously that's a very extreme example. And as the book goes on, there are smaller examples of jealousy. And for a lot of the first part of the book, there's a thing about how, for some reason, the scientists are afraid of what it would be like for Michael to meet a woman. Because on Mars, they don't have male and female sexes the way we do here on Earth. The way they explain it is that the Martians have a different life cycle. So in the early part of their life cycle, there's a point where I guess they can lay eggs or be impregnated. And then in a later part of their life cycle, they are able to fertilize the eggs or the younger Martians to create more Martians. And there's also another interesting thing that doesn't really come up until the end about how on Mars, it's kind of the reverse of the way we view life here, where life is most precious when it begins here on Earth, whereas over there, life is the least valuable when it begins, and they let their babies kind of just die off until only the strong survive, and those are the ones that get to make it into adulthood and be a part of society, and then eventually become what they call an old one, which is basically like your consciousness is a ghost. Which, this book, too, it has this weird theme, and it's a highly contentious book, and personally, I'm in the category of people that loves it, but I was not a fan of this bizarre subplot that the character Mike might be the Archangel Michael, and that the human consciousness goes somewhere else if we're able to, I guess, ascend to heaven. Like, if we've achieved that level of thought. That aspect of the story was kind of confusing to me. Especially the first time I read it. It made a little bit more sense on this second go-around reading it. So getting back to Michael's story, though, and how it relates to sexuality. So early on, this woman sneaks into his room where no women are supposed to be allowed, and he meets his first woman and finds out what the difference is. And during it, there's this thing about how it is strange for him to see a female for the first time, and he is kind of innocently curious about what the difference is between man and woman. Which, by the way, too, this book, for as much as I love it, it's got a lot of sexism in it. Like, there's some stuff that, like, it was pretty progressive for 1961, but reading it in the year 2021, so actually almost exactly 60 years later, there are definitely aspects that don't hold up. And personally, like, I am not very well versed in gender politics, although I am very aware of it. And I would be curious for people that are big believers in the, I guess not believers, I don't want to say that would imply that there's a certain amount of faith which is required in it, which is another topic of this book too. What is faith? What does it mean to have faith, and what is truth? But personally too, I consider the whole gender spectrum thing to be truth. If people feel differently than the way they were born, that's their own business, and they should live their life in whatever way makes them happy. But this book does talk a lot about the bipolarity of the sexes and how that affects human psychology, which I suppose as well that was the conception for much of human history. So even if it is a misconception that there is a bipolarity of the sexes, much of human history was governed by that misconception of bipolarity. But regardless of any out-of-date notions of gender roles, this book still has some incredibly sexist moments that are uncomfortable 60 years later. Like, the main character, Jubal, who is supposed to be a self-insert character for Heimlin, and a really fun character to read too. There are just large portions of the book that are just him going off on a dialogue, which is also why I'd recommend listening to the audiobook on Audible, which does not bring me to a sponsor because no one will ever sponsor this, even Audible, for all their willingness to sponsor just about anyone. But one of the more shocking lines in the book is when the character Jill tells Mike, and by the way, you have to keep in mind too, Jill is the first female that Mike meets. She teaches him a lot about what it means to be human, what it means to be sexual, and she also tells him that 9 times out of 10 when a woman is raped, it's her fault. And it's one of the most uncomfortable things to hear. I remember too, the first time I listened to the audiobook and that line came up, I was at work, my old job, and I was just shocked. And normally in this book, when a character says something that isn't so great, another character, usually Jubal, will chime in and tell them why they're wrong. But in that moment, there's nothing or no one to tell Jill why that line of thinking is wrong. And it seems to be like that is what Heimlin is saying. It's hard to tell. It could just be what the character thinks, but it's still not a great moment, at least in the way it's handled. And there are some other things too, though, where it's like, because obviously we still deal with sexism today. And there are still a lot of men that think women have no place in the workforce, or if they are in the workforce, that they should only be in subservient roles. And that is certainly the line of thinking of the character Stinky, a Muslim character, who at the beginning of the book has some kind of sexist thoughts, and at one point even, I think he says something like he just kind of gave up on finding a woman, or at least that he wouldn't marry outside of his faith. But certainly Heimlin did not predict how independent women would become in the future. And that's another thing too, like the way like Jubal basically surrounds himself with a harem of people that also work for him. Like the book makes no question that he is both having sex with them, but that they are also on his payroll. That is explicitly stated. But I'm going to get off this topic because I feel like it's distracting me from talking about the positive parts of the book, which even in those positive parts, there are negative aspects, such as with the way the book introduces the idea of polyamory. And I think, to me, this is part of why I was a little bit hesitant to identify as polyamorous, even though I also agreed with a lot of stuff in the book. And so where this really comes in is, I think, in the second act of the book, where Mike leaves with Jill on a kind of aimless journey around America to figure out what it means to be human. And along the way, he's also teaching Jill Martian. And the way the book explains it is that basically the Martian language kind of gives you insight into the way that the universe works and how matter is put together, particularly so that you could kind of deconstruct your own DNA. Because it's also talked about how Mike is able to control his body. Like, he's able to build his own muscle mass just by thinking about it. And he's even able to make his face less androgynous and more masculine at one point, just because Jill is afraid that he's going to attract some guys, which that's another thing too, is I can't tell if the book is homophobic or if Heimlin was just too afraid to bring in gay characters, because he does seem to acknowledge that there would be men that are attracted to Mike, as he receives many lewd photos from both women, but men whom are referred to as confused, which is why I'm like, is that homophobic? Or is that just what the character Jubal, who once again is a stand-in for Heimland, thinks about gay men? And then at another point too, there's something about how it says that Jill could not have handled it if she found out she had lesbian tendencies, which is also just another weird line that I'd really be curious to see how this book would be adapted today if you were to like try to modernize the story. But going back to the polyamorous part, so where it really starts to come in is when Jill becomes a stripper in Las Vegas and Mike goes to one of her shows. And using the Martian language, he's able to show her what it's like when other guys are looking at her and kind of get a read on their emotion. There's also a weird thing, too, about how the Martian language, if you know it, you may also be able to read minds. It's a lot to get into. This is a very bad spoiler review. So anyways, though, seeing the way that other guys see her kind of makes her realize, oh, there's nothing wrong with sharing her body and expressing herself through sexuality with other people besides just Mike. I really liked the way they had that discussion and the way that she came to that conclusion. And to some extent, I am kind of drawing inspiration from that in Her Forever Virgin, which I realize how stupid it sounds to compare my erotic novel to one of the greatest sci-fi classics of all time. Unless you're one of the haters of this book, in which case you're probably like, no, they're probably on the same quality. As for Her Forever Virgin's quality, I will not defend that. And so later on, though, in the book, it also discusses the other way that people kind of get drawn into this line of thinking. And then where I personally started getting confused and was like, I'm not really sure I want that. Especially considering that, a lot of this is what happened in the 60s after this book came out. So Mike's religion, which is called the Church of All Worlds, in which he teaches the Martian language to people, he creates like a family unit that is called a nest, and it's basically like one big polyamorous love circle. Which, if you're into that kind of thing, and if that's the lifestyle you want to live, and other people who are willing to live that life with you, by all means go for it. But that's not really what I want out of a polyamorous relationship, especially too, like in this book, there's this thing about how like, we can all just live off the land because this Martian religion also makes it so that we literally don't have to eat for days. Some of us who are good enough at it anyways. But in reality, there is no such Martian religion or powers which allow us to just not eat and have the energy for sex and to live for days at a time. No, we are bound by biology. And at least the way I've seen it played out in the modern world, where, it's like people trying to live off the land, that lifestyle personally doesn't really appeal to me. And I think I kind of alluded to this too, but also just being a member of a family like that, it's just not really something that appeals to me when I think about it. But I did like a lot of what he was talking about with the disassociation of ownership towards the ones that we love. And obviously, consent is the number one thing when it comes to relationships in the real world. Like, we can't all live that hippie commune lifestyle, as I've already said. It's not for everyone, and polyamory is certainly not for everyone. I personally can't stand those people that are so in their own head, or I guess up their own ass, that they think, well, if it works for me, it should work for everyone else. And that goes for anyone, whether you are a devout Christian or some polyamorous hippie living off the land with all your other commune lovers. Just let people live the life that works for them. Is that so much to ask for? Which is also to another interesting aspect of this book, actually, is that instead of trying to convert people away from their current religion, Mike's Church of All Worlds, partly because it is just a language school, tries to reconcile with all other religions by encouraging them to practice both faiths. Which I guess is something else too that it's also never really occurred to me until just right now that I'm recording this, is that the book does seem to imply that Judeo-Christian religions had it a little bit more right than all the other religions, at least in the context of this book. Although it does also seem to imply that there is something about reincarnation. I mean, if you've ever read other mythologies like Hindu mythology, you'll see that Heimlich is borrowing from more than just one place in terms of where he's drawing inspiration from. Something too, though, that surprised me, and by this point, when I'd read the book 3 years ago, even though I wasn't the Kinky caption crafter yet, I was still pretty certain in what I enjoyed. And this whole thing about being able to just think your body to what you want it to be, if you've read my captions, certainly enough of them, you might know that I have a thing for body transformation, like in a very fantastical and unrealistic way, which this book does, to the point that I actually even made a caption based on this book, which is actually why I ended up rereading it. God, I live the stupidest life. But there is something kind of appealing, though, like how it describes that Mike could just think his face from being less androgynous to more masculine. Like, I'm not uncomfortable in my own skin, but I also think sometimes it would be fun if I could be taller, or if I could be more, I guess, feminine for a sexual situation, and then just kind of go back to my regular self for my normal day-to-day life. Another aspect of the book that I personally also really enjoyed was how it discusses the ways in which we are always being sexual creatures, even if our intents aren't necessarily to have sex. Just in the little ways that we interact with the people that we're close with and the things we say. Although that once again does bring it back to that whole uncomfortable place of, by our modern day standards, Jubal's a pretty bad boss. But just kind of talking about the ways that we might say something to someone, or the complex ways that we might feel about somebody else. And that brings me to another thing that I love about this book, especially having read it on this second go-around. There's a common phrase derived from this book, or I suppose it's a word, rather, called grok. And commonly, like, if you hear a nerd use it, they're probably just saying that they grok it as a replacement for the word understanding. But the book discusses how to grok something means to understand it so entirely that you both hate it and love it in equal measure. And I don't think that's necessarily what Heimlich literally meant. That was more like Mike's way of trying to translate the Martian language. But I think what he's really trying to say, is that in relationships, we do have problems with the people we love. The people we love are flawed. There are things that drive me crazy about my partner, but we also continue to love them despite their flaws. And so, in that sense, we grok the people we love, the people we truly love. And I love this idea, though, of saying, like, yes, that there is some degree of hate in love, right? That you do have to understand and accept people for their flaws. And that it's entirely okay not to like those aspects about them. You know, like, we can go on having those problems and they can go on having those flaws, but as long as we understand that it is who they are, why shouldn't we love them? And I think that's my big takeaway from the second reading of the book, though, is that for me to feel love for someone, even if it's not particularly strong or passionate, I do also need to see the flaws in them, the things about them which I do dislike, because it makes them a more complete person. And to me, there's something more attractive about getting to see all the parts of a person, even the parts they don't want you to see. That is, I don't know, it's kind of sexy in its own way. The idea that someone would be open enough with you to share the things that they would rather be hidden. So I realized that I've been pretty rambly during this entire review. So I just want to end it by saying that, I would not recommend reading this book to learn about polyamory. One, because there's actually tons of academic material that can give you a lot more information that is factual and based on real human psychological studies, or at least personal experiences. But also because I think this book presents only one very specific kind of polyamorous relationship, which, I mean, for as much as I talked about it, that it's not for me personally, I also realized that because of especially what happened with the Manson case, that particular style of living has a very negative connotation associated with it. In fact, after the Manson case, this book got banned from high school libraries. Little fun fact there. But so if you've actually taken the time to listen to all of this, I hope you'll take the time to hear me plug away my plugs. You can find me on Twitter, where I am getting a little bit better at posting, at Kinky Crafter. You can follow me on Reddit, which is for some reason where I care about getting followers, even though I really shouldn't, by searching user/Kinky Crafter. You can check out my blog, kinkycaptioncrafter.blogspot.com, where I post everything that I work on related to this. And if for some reason you think I deserve money for recording this and creating erotic captions, you can go to patreon.com/kinkycaptioncrafter. So with that, thank you, and thou art God.